Hi again, everyone. Welcome back to Harmonic Resonance 101. I'm Horus the Elder. I realize I didn't introduce myself in the last video, and thank you for coming back to watch more of my videos. I really appreciate it. Now, today, I'd like to just explore a little more of what brought me to starting this channel. What motivates me? Why start this channel? And to answer that, I think I have to go back to an earlier point in my life. When I was younger than I am now, roughly about 17, 18, junior year, senior year of high school, I got involved in a relationship that I thought was very serious because I was so young and inexperienced. I became very infatuated. My identity became completely absorbed into this person. So much so that I ended up severing ties with family. People tried to tell me that this relationship seemed problematic. It seemed like it wasn't good for me. But I didn't listen. Of course, I was blinded by what I thought was love. And things developed. Events happened. And eventually, the relationship ended. And this left me in the first real depressive episode of my life. Before that in my life, I had always had issues with anxiety, with overthinking, with not fitting in, feeling weird, feeling out of place. But it wasn't until this experience that I really felt depression, where I'm not even sure how long it was, but I just remember a phase immediately following this experience where I did not want to get out of bed. I did not want to face the day. I did not want to do anything. I was completely miserable. And in hindsight now, I realize why. But at the time, I didn't. All I knew was it hurt. And I didn't feel like going on. Nothing seemed to matter. And then I'm not exactly sure of the process or how it happened, but somehow I started going to church. And I became very, very, very religious. I dove headfirst into Christianity and I didn't look back. I was completely dedicated to fully embracing this ideology and this way of life because I was so desperate for some sense of meaning now that it seemed like all of what I thought my life was supposed to be had been ripped away. And so I became a very adamant and passionate evangelical Christian. I began learning everything I could, reading the Bible, praying, going to church regularly, several times a week. And it was a very interesting phase of my life. I went on mission trips to South Padre to give free rides to people during spring break. And also, of course, to try to evangelize to them in the process. And that was a very interesting experience. I went several years. I even went with both of my siblings, which was also interesting. There were a lot of really great times in this part of my life, of course, but now I kind of look back on them and don't have a very positive view because of the developments that followed. I, like many intelligent people who become educated, I felt a strong tension between the things I was learning in church and the things I was learning in college. There seemed this incompatibility almost between science and religion. And this is not a unique experience, it's a very common one, I believe. But what this led me to was to become disillusioned with Christianity, to doubt it very, very strongly. I saw a lot of people talking about things that they didn't practice. I also felt a lot of inner conflict because I felt like one of those people who, despite my best efforts, seemed to not make a lot of progress in areas of my life where I struggled. Despite my best efforts, I just seemed to keep having the same struggles over and over. And I think this, coupled with my disillusionment with organized religion and all its flaws, led me to just basically just leave the church. And I became an atheist. I would even say, an anti-theist. I believed God was a delusion, that it was a fantasy, a form of wish fulfillment to give us some peace of mind in the face of death, in the face of the unknown, in the face of our ignorance. And I held this belief very strongly until pretty recently. Now I've come to re-examine a lot of things about religion in general, about spirituality and its relationship with science. So my atheist phase, my anti-theist phase, lasted a while. I was very smug in this stage. I thought I was very intellectually superior, right? As if I had seen through the illusion of religion and I was somehow this brave being for having discarded this childish ideology and embarking out into the unknown on my own. And I remember very much liking watching videos of other atheists uh, disproving arguments for God's existence or arguing with theists about these things. I especially remember being very interested in Christopher Hitchens and people like him at the time. I'm not exactly sure how it happened, but somehow the atheism also just didn't quite fit. It seemed to leave out some very important parts of life that I had experienced that atheism just didn't seem to give a very good account of. The materialist perspective just seemed to leave out so much that we couldn't explain about our experience as humans. Also, in the same way that as a Christian, I had a lot of cognitive dissonance and tension with the doctrines of Christianity and their interaction with secular ideas. Well, now on the other side, as an atheist, it was a similar kind of thing where it was difficult to completely rid myself, I believe, of a lot of ideas from Christianity that had been ingrained in me from an early age, and because of the culture and society I live in. And so there was still this tension. Like I said, atheism seemed to leave out something, to miss something. Just didn't seem to be the full picture. And so at some point, I began to explore different religions. I became very interested in Buddhism, in Zen, in Hinduism, in Vedanta. I studied psychology and philosophy, and I just had a voracious appetite for knowledge because I just so badly wanted to see the big picture. I wanted truth. I wanted to know what reality was and what my place in it was. So around this time in my life, I was in what I would now see as a extended adolescence almost. I was going to college, working part-time in the library there, and I was very comfortable because I lived with my father who made pretty good money at the time, and I didn't really ever want for anything. I was very comfortable, very much relied on him to have a very laid back lifestyle where I could pursue my education, uh, had very little responsibility. And then this all seemed to shift in a dramatic way when my father lost his job. I was in my 20s at the time, I forget exactly when, but this was a very big shift in my life because he didn't go back to work at all. And there came a point where he had to move in with his father to help take care of him. And I was left to make a decision. Would I grow up and begin to take responsibility for my life? Or the alternative, which seemed not very good. So I began the process of trying to grow up, trying to become an adult. And it's been a messy process, to say the least. But I've learned a great deal about myself along the way and what I'm capable of. So after my father lost his job, I tried my best to become a provider in the way that he had for so long. I tried to take care of the bills, I tried for a while to keep his home by trying to pay the note, but I just couldn't manage it on my own with the meager income that I had. And so he eventually lost his trailer that we were living in. This was after he had already moved out and I was living in it alone with my partner. But once it was gone, I was faced with another crossroads, another fork in the road. I had to decide. I had land here that was still in my father's name, and I had options. And so what I chose was to begin building a house. And it's been a very challenging process that still isn't complete, but I have a house I can live in that's mine. So, as I said, after this crossroads, and I decided to stay here and build something on the land that my father had given me. One aspect of this story that I had forgotten to mention was dropping out of college. I had transferred from a community college after getting an associate's to a university, and I was commuting all the way downtown. It was about a roughly an hour drive both ways, and I wasn't super crazy about the commuting aspect, but I did really enjoy a lot of the experiences I had at the university. I majored in mathematics, and it was very intellectually stimulating. But at some point, I just hit this wall where I just didn't know exactly why I was pursuing the path I was pursuing. I didn't really know where I was headed. And I was very stressed at the time. I was dealing with a lot. And so I decided to drop out. And it's something I still regret to this day, but it's what happened. And after that, I changed jobs and I took a position in sales in a store. And it was one of the most stressful jobs I ever had because it was so out of my comfort zone. At the time, I was very socially anxious. I had a really hard time being social, talking to people. And so I felt a lot of anxiety on a daily basis there. And eventually I quit. And it was the first time I'd ever quit a job without having another one. And it was a rough decision. Even at the time, I remember doubting it, thinking that it was the wrong decision and that I was just quitting because it was difficult and that I should have stuck with it and found another job first. But I didn't. So I was out of work for several months, and that was a very, very difficult time in my life because I didn't have someone to catch me, essentially. I had to rely on myself. And so after a few months, I actually, I may be misremembering. I think what happened after I quit that job is shortly after quitting, I began working doing construction, which was another very interesting phase because it was very out of my comfort zone in a very different way than the sales position was. This was, manual labor. This was something I was also not very keen on and not very good at, but I was desperate. And it was also a really positive thing in hindsight because that job taught me a lot of discipline. It taught me to do things that I didn't want to do, like get up at 4 in the morning every day and go do manual labor all day, even though I was exhausted. I also got in really good physical shape because of the nature of the work. And it was also very satisfying to learn these very hands on skills. But unfortunately, I also quit that job because I couldn't handle certain aspects of it. And then I was out of work for several months. And those were some very hard months. I didn't have an income. I didn't have much of a safety net. I mean, I had people I could ask for help, but I felt very alone, very stressed and depressed, and I felt like a failure at life. I felt like I had given up on everything and just couldn't follow through because I did not know. Now I realize I did not know what I wanted in life. I had never really thought about it. I thought I knew, But I realize now that so much of what I thought I wanted was what I thought I should want, or what I thought would make me happy, or thought would make me successful. I had never thought about what kind of a life I wanted to live. And so when things got tough, it was easy for me to quit because I didn't have a vision. So during this period, I recall discovering a man named Alan Watts. And I will forever credit him, despite the fact that he was not even alive when I found out about him, with helping me to survive that phase of life. Because it was a dark phase for me. But his voice and his wisdom, I became mildly obsessed with listening to his lectures. And his voice was very soothing to me, and the things he was saying made me think about reality in a very, very different way than I ever had. It changed my awareness. And eventually, I got another job at the job I'm at currently, where I've been for just about 10 years, an entire decade. It's crazy to think about, but it's true. And so this almost brings us up to the present. I don't know if this will be interesting to anyone, honestly, but I hope it will. So I continued to learn. I continued to explore ideas, to try to synthesize different disciplines, different fields of study into something approximating a worldview. And it was very chaotic because there were so many different elements of different fields of study and different religions and different uh, practices that appealed to me, that resonated with me, if you will. And so this went on and on. And despite all this knowledge, despite all of this information I had gathered and done my best to try to work into something approximating a systematic view of reality, it was very disjointed, and it was very, very much not a cohesive worldview. And I was also pretty miserable a lot of the times. I would just, I would deal with a lot of anxiety. I would get frustrated very easily when things didn't go my way. I had bouts of depression. I had all sorts of internal struggles. So to skip ahead slightly, I now have 2 kids. I'm married. My house isn't finished, but it's come a long way, and it feels really good. And I feel proud of myself. But I was still fairly miserable very often. I remember many, many days of waking up and instantly feeling a sense of dread at facing the day. being so afraid of all the things that could go wrong constantly, to where I became very risk avoidant. I essentially began to shut off. I didn't feel joy. This isn't, this happened obviously way before this, started way before this. But yeah, I slowly, over many years, began to feel less joy. I didn't enjoy things that I used to enjoy. Previously, I'd been very interested in drawing. I loved to draw. I made such progress in drawing when I was in college, in art, and in making music, in writing. I just had a very strong desire to express myself and create. And that slowly went away as I became more and more depressed, more and more anxious, more and more fearful. All these negative emotions that I couldn't handle and didn't have any skills to cope with forced me to begin to shut down emotionally, to start repressing these emotions. And it got to the point where I just felt very dead inside. I couldn't sit and play with my kids and enjoy it. I didn't know how to. Everything was so serious in my life. And it was one crisis after another after another. And I was constantly in a state of fight or flight. I didn't realize it at the time that this is what was going on, but it was. Everything was an emergency. There was always some crisis that I could sit and ruminate on and drive myself crazy with because it was uncertain how it would turn out. And then whenever that crisis would inevitably resolve itself, I would immediately move on to a new one. And this was my life for so long until very recently. A few days before New Year's 2025, I was at work like any other night, and I decided that rather than listening to YouTube videos about politics and world events and the things I had been obsessed with for quite a while, I would instead try something a little different. You see, I had struggled for the past year or so with parenting. I mean, I had struggled from the moment my kids were born, but the last year had been very challenging because my daughter was now 6, my son was 2. They both had their own challenges, of course, and I found myself very often losing my temper and yelling, and I started to lose hope that I was going to ever get any better at being a dad. I also started to entertain this question, and that was, are my kids just bad? Do I just have bad kids? And intuitively, I knew that was probably not the case. So, this night at work, I decided, rather than do what I normally do and listen to things that often get me upset and often make me stressed and often lead to a feeling of powerlessness and hopelessness and despair, what if instead I tried to find things to watch that could potentially help me become a better parent? I was looking, honestly, for just some tricks, some strategies to try to help me to stay calm whenever my kids were difficult. And this led me to find several different people on YouTube who were sharing messages about parenting. Well, I should say one person in particular, Dr. Becky, was one of the first that I recall discovering that made a significant impact. And her biggest impact was this idea that children and people are good inside, but that we also sometimes behave badly. And this idea of separating our identity from our behavior was a revolutionary thought for me in the way that she expressed it. Because what often happens is we collapse people's identity with their behavior. And so we see bad behavior and we think that person is bad. When in reality, at least if you believe Dr. Becky, we are good. But sometimes we do bad things. And I very much resonated with this because I genuinely felt that my kids were incredible. They were amazing. They were so innocent and so good. But they also did things that really bothered me at times. Things that made me angry. Things that I just couldn't handle. I didn't know how to handle. And this was a big turning point for me when I started to look at my own I started to look at my inability to regulate my own emotions. And I started to learn why I couldn't regulate my emotions and what I could potentially do to begin practicing regulation. And it led me on a path of self honesty that seemed to cause a very big shift in my thinking and my mindset. And somehow, all of a sudden, it seemed something changed. All the noise and the mental chatter that seemed so ever present was a lot less loud. It was a lot quieter. And this happened progressively. It happened somewhat gradually. It also felt like a switch flipping in a way. Something clicked into place after all the years of exploring and trying to synthesize. And another big aspect, I think, of the switch flipping was the utilization of artificial intelligence. It helped me to synthesize these things into what I'm now referring to as harmonic resonance. This ideology that I'm trying to explore, develop, and eventually teach and share and use in my own life. Now, after this process began, I felt an incredible amount of energy and enthusiasm to continue the process. It's hard to even convey the contrast between what I felt like before this and what I feel like the majority of the time now. It was literally night and day. I was constantly miserable before. I was always tired. I never had energy, always stressed, always worried, always afraid. And most of the time, I was not very social. I was very isolated. I was very withdrawn from people. And I was very judgmental of other people. Now, everything is different. Probably 90% of the time, I feel pretty good. And there's still times where I struggle, where old patterns pop up. But those times are much, much less frequent now, and they also last a shorter duration now. And I credit this to a lot of the skills that I was able to integrate into my life from these very wise people that I discovered. A lot of things I learned just seemed to all line up with all the things I had learned before. And it was like a key fitting into a lock and turning. And my mind just worked better. And with the use of AI, I began to essentially have a discourse with the AI in an attempt to develop this ideology further, to find new ways to improve it, to find blind spots that I might be missing. And it's evolved quite a bit from where it started. Originally, I was calling it compassionate resonance. Now, I'm calling it harmonic resonance because I just think the name fits better, and we'll get into that in the future. But I guess what I wanted to achieve with this video was to try to capture, in the best way I could, the process of what I would call waking up that happened to me. And I don't think it was the first time it had happened to me, but it feels fundamentally different this time than it had in the past. And more than waking up, I think I've begun a process of growing up. And this is what I attribute all of the positive growth and development that I've experienced in a very short time. And so, if anyone's made it through this, I genuinely thank you for your attention. And I hope you'll come back as I try to grow this channel into something that can help people. I want you to be a part of it. I want you to help me build this channel into something that this channel has a lot of growth to do. And I'm working behind the scenes to try to gain the skills and the knowledge to put those ideas into reality here. And I hope you'll be patient and stick around and let me know what you like about the channel so far. And I look forward to hearing any feedback from anyone who finds this interesting. Anyone who this resonates with, I want you here, and I want to learn from you as well. So with that, I'll thank you again for your time and attention, and happy resonating.